He just wanted to renovate his backyard, nothing special. A sunny Saturday, a shovel, a strong cup of coffee, and the distant sound of children playing. But when Jack Bennett hit something metal 6 feet underground, his life turned upside down. And no, it wasn't an old pipe or a forgotten trunk. It was something impossible, a time capsule. From the future. Engraved on it, in worn letters, was the year 2075, and along with it, a question that wouldn't let him sleep for the next few nights. Why was it there? And why did it seem to have been left for him? Now imagine, what if you found an artifact that shouldn't exist, containing devices that no one recognizes, a letter with your own name and handwriting identical to yours, written by your future self? What would you do? Would you throw it away, investigate it, or ignore it as if nothing had happened? Jack chose the most unlikely path, to face the unknown. And what he discovered was more than advanced technology. It was a message, a warning of what could still happen, and how to avoid it. Get ready for a realistic and fantastic story where science fiction and emotion intertwine to reveal what exists between time, choices, and destiny. What if all of this is nothing more than a cycle? What if our decisions today are the pieces that assemble the puzzle of tomorrow? This is a story about love, fear, perseverance, and reconciliation. A story that begins with a hole in the ground ... and ends with a buried letter to the future. He found a time capsule from 2075, and what was inside could change everything you believe about time and about yourself. Curious? Then don't look away. What comes next could change the way you see the world, and maybe your own story. Jack Bennett never imagined that ordinary Saturday, with clear skies and a light wind blowing from the north, would mark the beginning of a journey capable of bending the notions of reality that he had carried since he was a child. An electrical technician with 38 years of a routine marked by bills, emergency calls, and reheated coffee, he finally decided to renovate the backyard of his modest home in a quiet town in the interior of North Carolina. With a shovel, a radio playing at a low volume, and his dog Toby digging by his side, he dug down 2 meters without any pretension when the shovel hit something metal. A dry, hollow sound, almost as if time had snapped. Jack knelt down, cleaned it with his dirty hands, and found the cylinder. A seamless artifact, sealed with millimeter perfection, made of a material that didn't seem like it was from this world. But it was the inscription that immediately froze him, opening only in 2075. That didn't make any sense. His first impulse was to laugh, a nervous laugh, full of insecurity, typical of someone who faces fear without a choice. He felt a mixture of childish curiosity and a strange pang of anxiety in his chest. After all, what could that be? Some kind of joke? A forgotten college experiment? Or worse, a trap? The solitude of that moment was filled with a strange kind of affection, as if someone, from some point in time, had prepared all this just for him. And that was when the spark of understanding began to be born. He knew that life had more questions than answers, but there, in that moment, the ancient wisdom seemed to whisper something. Not everything that is buried is dead. The capsule still carried an invisible power. The power of goodness of the universe, perhaps, or a warning. And it was Jack who held the key. Taking the capsule inside was an act of courage and also of resilience. Even without knowing what to do with it, Jack felt that he was facing an adventure as real as it was invisible, where each choice would require emotional intelligence, initiative, and above all, confidence. His hands were shaking, but his heart was beating strongly. This was more than a discovery, it was a call to overcome. For the first time in a long time, he felt a spark of inspiration. He remembered his mother, who would say, "Son, life always holds a surprise for those who choose to dig deeper." It was a simple phrase, but full of love and wisdom. Now, faced with the impossible, Jack would understand that the greatest time capsule was not the metal one in front of him, but rather the human mind, capable of storing fears, secrets, and also solutions. And deep down, something told him this was just the beginning. When he finally opened the capsule after hours of studying it, observing every detail with the perspicacity of someone searching for something they don't even know what it is, Jack came across the inexplicable. It wasn't an explosion, nor flashing lights or mysterious sounds. It was silence. A silence that seemed to respect the moment, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. Inside, wrapped in a material similar to synthetic velvet, lay unknown devices, as if they belonged to a science fiction store in the heart of the future. One of them was shaped like a flattened drop with no buttons. Another looked like a type of flash drive, but its design was organic, almost alive. There were also sheets with symbols that floated gently, as if the paper were made of air. And among all that lay a letter, folded, discreet. But the detail that took Jack's breath away was the name at the bottom of the signature. The handwriting? Identical to his. The impossible was naked before him. Jack sat on the floor. His hands were sweating, his heart was beating out of rhythm. He wasn't afraid of what was in the capsule, it was afraid of what it meant. It was as if he had stepped through a mirror and seen himself on the other side, without understanding how he had gotten there. The letter seemed full of affection and honesty. It had something paternal about it, as if someone older was offering a helping hand to avoid a precipice. But there was also a shadow of urgency, a plea full of compassion and hope. It was as if the future was screaming at him to change something now. Jack looked at those objects, so strange and yet so familiar, and felt his skin crawl. What would he do with all of that? Throw it away? Lock it in a safe? Hide it? Or investigate, even at the risk of not being able to go back? Each hypothesis generated a wave of insecurity, but it also ignited something new, initiative. And there, in the stillness of the room, surrounded by enigmas that no one else would understand, Jack felt the presence of humanity itself pulsing in his chest. He understood that this moment was not just his, it belonged to all those who believe that it is possible to rewrite destiny. That capsule was more than a temporal anomaly. It was a spark of innovation, an invitation to collaborate with what is yet to come. He thought of the great inventors, the visionaries of history, the people who dared to look beyond people like Nikola Tesla, Alan Turing, or even modern figures like Elon Musk. If all of them had ignored their inner time capsules, where would we be today? Jack, an ordinary man, now had before him a rare chance to become part of something greater. And as he touched once more that object that emitted a gentle vibration at his touch, he felt a metaphorical whisper in the air. Are you ready to see what comes next? The letter was written on plain paper, but each word seemed to weigh tons. Jack unfolded it carefully, as if handling a sacred relic. The content began with a simple sentence. If you are reading this before 2030, there is still time. Time for what? He thought, his mind racing. The following lines revealed a tangle of details that touched deep into his soul. Advice on decisions he didn't even know he would have to make. Warnings about people he didn't even know yet. And a narrative full of emotional intelligence, as if someone knew exactly where each of his wounds was hidden. It was a letter written with love, but also with an almost painful sense of urgency. The tone was direct, but full of understanding and kindness. There was the sweetness of someone who wants to protect, and the desperation of someone who knows that time is not a reliable ally. As he read, Jack felt as if an invisible hand was guiding him through memories he had not yet experienced. The letter mentioned specific dates, global events, environmental collapses, political decisions, and even social catastrophes. But the most impactful thing was not the informative content, it was the human, compassionate, almost paternal tone with which each revelation was made, as if the author of the letter, himself, years ahead, had learned from the pain, but had chosen forgiveness. The message was clear. The only way to save the future was to act in the present, with courage, with altruism, with resilience. It was as if he were in a deep conversation with a wise old man who happened to be himself. And this feeling of reconciliation with his own destiny brought a commotion that Jack had never experienced. His eyes filled with tears. He was not crying out of fear. He was crying out of hope. The final part of the letter read, "Some things will seem impossible, but don't get lost. The truth will come in pieces. Trust those who seem different. Don't underestimate the quiet kindness. And if you ever have to choose between running or fighting, choose love." Jack folded the letter again, as if closing a sacred book. This wasn't just a warning, it was a mirror of the soul. A reminder that even small, everyday decisions can change the course of an entire life. He stood up with a new sparkle in his eyes. It was as if each word in that letter had renewed his faith in humanity, even in the face of the approaching chaos. And more than ever, he understood that the time capsule wasn't about the future. It was about the now, but something still pulsed inside him, And what was on that mysterious flash drive could change everything again. It took Jack a while to work up the courage to insert the flash drive into his computer. It was no ordinary device. Its metallic surface seemed to pulse gently, almost like a miniature heart. When he finally connected the device, there was no loading window, no startup screen. The device simply projected an image in the air, like a small hologram. And there he was older, his eyes marked by the pain that was yet to come. The video began with a cold introduction. Images of the devastated planet, oceans covered in plastic, urban fires, abandoned cities. But what was most frightening was not the destruction, it was the silence. A heavy silence, as if humanity had lost its voice. Jack's figure in the video spoke firmly, but his voice trembled. "If you're watching this, then there's still a chance." For the entire 7 minutes of the video, Jack couldn't blink. It was like watching the end of a story he hadn't yet begun to live. The video showed protests, institutional collapses, extreme technological advances used for social control. But it also showed moments of beauty, communities rebuilding through collaboration, children smiling in makeshift shelters, people sharing food amidst chaos, acts of kindness and altruism that seemed like seeds in a barren land. And there was the countdown. In the bottom corner of the hologram, decreasing numbers marked the time remaining until something that was not revealed. The figure of an older Jack spoke about wrong decisions, about wasted opportunities, but also about redemption. Reconciliation, love. The future is made of choices. And you still have yours. Turning off the video was like waking up from a tense dream or an enlightening nightmare. Jack rose from his chair in silence. He had just seen not only what could happen to the world, but what could happen to himself. And for the first time, he felt the real weight of responsibility. This was not just about him. It was about all of us. That capsule was a plea, a cry for collective understanding. As he thought about it, he remembered something he had heard in a lecture some time ago. Technology is neutral. What we do with it reveals who we are. Jack then felt the spark of the initiative ignite within him. There was no turning back. If the truth was hidden in time, it was time to search for it with wisdom, intelligence, perseverance. But he still had no idea how all that connected with the remaining objects. And deep down, he felt that the strangest thing was yet to come. Jack knew he would not be able to decipher the mysteries hidden in this technology so far ahead of its time on his own. Among the remaining objects, a small oval device stood out. When he brought his hand closer, it changed color, sometimes amber, sometimes deep blue, and emitted a sound similar to a whisper. It was as if the object itself was aware of his presence. Intrigued, Jack sought help at the local university, where he knew an old colleague from his time in technical school. The experimental physics laboratory greeted the enigma with skepticism, but scientific curiosity soon gave way to fascination. The composition of the material did not correspond to anything known, and its physical reactions contradicted fundamental laws of thermodynamics. It was as if the device were a direct provocation to human intelligence, an invitation to innovation, or, who knows, a test. Days passed and the enigma only grew. One of the scientists commented jokingly, "This looks like something out of an alien movie or time travel." Jack just smiled sideways, not daring to tell the whole truth. The kindness with which they treated him, however, awakened a wave of gratitude in him. For the first time since he found the capsule, he felt less alone. In that space where science and imagination touched, a sense of collaboration flourished, an unspoken alliance between curious brains and awakened hearts. Still, none of them managed to even scratch the object's functionality. Neither heat, nor pressure, nor electromagnetic waves had any effect. It only reacted to Jack, as if they were connected. It was a clue, or perhaps a provocation. Something bigger was behind that contact between the past and what was yet to come. It was on one of those nights, when he returned from the laboratory, that Jack began to reflect more deeply. What if all of this was part of a much more elaborate plan? What if those objects had come with a mission, but a mission that he did not yet understand? He remembered the letter, the video, and now that object that reacted only to him. It was as if the universe had chosen someone ordinary for something extraordinary. A mission that would require more than courage. It would require wisdom, insight, and most importantly, self-confidence. Jack knew that every true hero is born from doubt, fear, and loneliness. But he also knew that where there is love, there is hope. And although scientists were unable to decipher the technology, Jack was beginning to understand that the key might not lie in logic, but in something more human. Something that would lead him straight to the next and most disturbing chapter, the appearance of the men in black. 2 days after his last visit to the laboratory, the silence of the neighborhood was broken by the muffled sound of a black car pulling up in front of Jack's house. A sedan with tinted windows, too discreet to be a coincidence. 2 men got out, dressed in impeccable suits and with a kind of calm that bordered on menace. They rang the doorbell just once, as if they were certain they would be answered. Jack opened the door, trying to appear natural, but the feeling that something was out of place took over him. "We're from the National Security Agency," one of them said, showing a badge that was too generic to be convincing. They wanted to see the capsule. They didn't ask, they demanded. And in their eyes, there was more than authority. There was an absence of empathy. It was as if they were programmed to neutralize, not to understand. Jack hesitated, and that hesitation was enough for the men to look at each other, as if they had just confirmed a suspicion. The visit went on for almost an hour. They asked too many specific questions, mentioned technical terms that even he didn't know, and at one point, one of them insinuated, "You wouldn't want to carry the burden of information you shouldn't have, would you?" The sentence was said with artificial gentleness, but it carried a veiled threat. It was as if they were there not just to investigate, but to manipulate. And that was when Jack understood. They knew. They knew more than they were letting on. And they were there not to help him, but to control what he had discovered. This was no longer just about the capsule. It was about the power it represented. Their intelligence was not in the search for truth, but in how to shape narratives. And that, to Jack, was unacceptable. After the men left, Jack stood at the door, his heart pounding. A mixture of anger, fear, and a strange sense of purpose mixed within him. This was a warning. The capsule was not only a portal to the future, but also a magnet for dark interests. He realized that his mission would not only be to understand the signals, it would also be to protect them. There, faced with that veiled threat, a new version of himself was born. Braver, more suspicious, but also more determined. It was the beginning of a silent war, where the truth was the most dangerous weapon. And as he reflected on all this, he noticed something even more disturbing. The flash drive was not where he had left it. Someone had touched it, or taken it. And that changed everything. The next morning, Jack woke up to the sound of sirens. A fire had taken over the laboratory that analyzed the objects in the capsule. The flames consumed everything in a matter of minutes, and the local investigators seemed more concerned with closing the case than understanding what had really happened. For Jack, this was no coincidence. It was a message, a reminder that he was now being watched. And most disturbing of all, the two scientists who had led the analysis had simply disappeared. Without a trace, without warning, without goodbyes. It was as if they had been wiped off the map. It left Jack feeling helpless, but it also ignited his resolve. He knew he was dealing with something much bigger than himself, and that the only way to survive was to trust his own intelligence and not underestimate the power of goodness that still existed in the world. Gradually, other signs that he was being followed began to appear. A white car parked on the corner every day, silent phone calls in the middle of the night, and even a strange envelope left in his mailbox with just one word written on it: stop. But how could he stop when everything inside him was screaming for answers? Jack found himself in a state of constant tension. He slept with one eye open, moved cautiously, but never lost the essence of who he was. His humanity, his compassion, and his sense of justice could not be nullified. Even as his fear grew, he found strength in the solidarity of strangers. A neighbor who warned him about suspicious movements. A distant friend who warned him about possible eavesdropping in his house. Small gestures, but full of affection, that rekindled his faith in humanity. The capsule, once an object of fascination, now seemed like a curse. But Jack knew he could not simply bury it again and pretend nothing had happened. That would be an act of cowardice. He understood that the capsule was more than a message from the future. It was a provocation to the present. And deep down, he felt that all this chaos was part of a test, to test his courage, his resilience, his ability to do what is right even when everything seems against it. The disappearance of evidence and people was painful, but revealing. He learned that when the system fears the truth, it destroys it silently. But for every voice silenced, another rises with more strength. And it was time for Jack to find someone who could help him understand the strangest part of this whole story: the time anomalies. And so, fate would place a long-forgotten name in his path, that of an old scientist. The contact came through an anonymous note left under the door. In bold letters, it was written, "Look for Dr. Malcolm Reeve, he knows." Jack spent hours cross-referencing names in old records until he found a modest reference: a retired professor from Princeton University, a theoretical physicist specializing in unconventional studies. In the 1990s, he had been ridiculed for presenting a hypothesis about warp points in time anchored by human consciousness. The scientific community treated him with disdain, but he never stopped researching. Jack got in touch. Malcolm, now over 80 years old, lived isolated in a simple house in the mountains of Colorado, surrounded by books, notebooks, and maps. When he heard Jack's story, he showed no surprise. He simply murmured, with the serenity of someone who has seen too much. So, it finally happened. That night, in front of the fireplace, Dr. Reeve shared his theory with the clarity of a master and the humility of someone who knows the limits of his own wisdom. He believed that time, like space, can be manipulated, not by machines, but by elevated states of emotional consciousness. For him, extreme events of fear, love, forgiveness, or sacrifice could create natural temporal folds, like open doors between different moments of existence. You were chosen not because you are special, Jack, but because you were in a specific state at the exact moment. That is emotional intelligence in action, he explained. Jack listened to everything with a mixture of astonishment and recognition. It was as if all the pieces began to fit together. The capsule was not just an object from the future, it was an echo, a reflection of choices that perhaps he had not even made yet. And that changed everything. Dr. Reeve showed old documents, letters, and even reports of other anomalies similar to the one Jack had encountered. Cities that disappeared for seconds. People who claimed to have lived days and minutes. He spoke with understanding, but also with sadness in his eyes, like someone who spent his entire life carrying truths that no one wanted to hear. At the end of the conversation, he said something that would echo in Jack's mind. You have the chance to do what I never managed to do, protect the correct timeline. That wasn't just science. It was spirituality, it was philosophy, it was the intersection between the visible and the invisible. Jack said goodbye with a heavy heart and at the same time renewed. He left there with more questions than answers, but with something new in his chest: trust and a dilemma. A dilemma that would soon become unbearable. Destroy or protect the capsule? Jack spent days in complete isolation. Not because he wanted to, but because he needed to silence the world in order to hear himself. The dilemma was visceral. Protect the capsule, keep it as a seed of the future, or destroy it, preventing it from falling into the wrong hands. On one side, the power to preserve the message, the warning, the chance to rewrite paths. On the other hand, there was the legitimate fear that it could be used as a weapon. Jack remembered the agents, the veiled threats, the disappearances. All of that screamed danger. But the letter begged for hope, and there was a phrase that wouldn't leave his head. If you're reading this before 2030, there's still time. Time to change, time to stop it, or time to fall into the same trap again. It was a cycle, and he was right in the middle of it. Thinking about destroying the capsule was like thinking about ripping out a part of himself. Every object, every symbol, every fragment of the holographic video was now part of his identity. Jack was no longer the man who dug up his backyard to plant rose bushes. He had become the guardian of an enigma greater than logic, greater, even, than time itself. He felt the weight of all of humanity in his hands, and deep down, he was also afraid. Not the fear of the dark or of death, but that deeper fear, the fear of making the wrong choice. Destroying the capsule could erase the warning, cutting the life-saving inspiration, but protecting it would require a life of silence, sacrifice, and concealment. How could you keep something so valuable without sharing it? How could you trust that tomorrow wouldn't be worse if today was silent? It was then that Jack had a radical thought. What if all of this was only happening because, in some future time, he had decided to act? What if the contents of the capsule, the video itself, the letter, the objects only existed because of his choices in the present? It was the paradox of action. Perhaps protecting it would be the very trigger that would start the chaos he wanted to avoid. Perhaps the more he tried to prevent the future, the more he would provoke it. But there was also another possibility, that acting with love, with intelligence, and with a collective vision could finally break the cycle. It was a choice that no one else could make for him. And as Jack stared at the capsule gleaming in the dim light of the porch, he realized that time was really about choices, and that true power lay in the sincerity with which one chose. All that remained was to decide, or do it again, Jack walked slowly to an isolated field on the outskirts of the city, carrying the capsule and a new letter. The sky was clear, but there was a tension in the air, as if time was watching every step he took. In his mind, a single question pulsed with the force of silent thunder. What if all of this is a cycle? Not just an event that repeats itself, but a pattern intrinsic to existence itself. What became of free will in the face of temporal repetition? Perhaps time was not linear, but emotional. Perhaps our decisions now echoed like waves in directions that logic could not yet reach. Jack felt that by burying the capsule again, but in a new location, far from the previous one, he would be more than protecting information. He would be restarting the process. Resilience, humility, and intelligence guided him at that moment. And with steady hands and a beating heart, he began to dig. As Jack placed the objects, one by one, inside the cylinder, he did so not as if he were burying a secret, but as if he were planting hope. He added the new letter to the capsule, written with a mixture of altruism, honesty, and silent inspiration. If you found this, then the wheel has turned once more. And this time, perhaps you will do it differently. It was a message not only for himself, but for any future soul who might come across that artifact. A feeling of emotion took hold of him completely. It was as if he, Jack Bennett, was now part of an invisible chain of consciousness's men and women who, through generations, had tried to warn, preserve, transform. The capsule no longer belonged to the future. It belonged to the cycle of humanity itself. And at that moment, Jack understood that the true time capsule was the heart. That is where fears are stored, but also the paths to solutions. As he covered the last handful of earth on the capsule, Jack looked to the horizon. The camera, positioned far away, captured the silhouette of an ordinary man who had traversed the impossible and returned with more questions than answers. He looked into the lens calmly and firmly, and he simply said, "The next chance will be in 2075. Be ready." It was the speech of someone who understood that we won't always have all the explanations, but we will always have choices. And that the courage to do the right thing, even without guarantees, is what separates us from stagnation. The capsule remained there, silent, pulsing underground as a reminder. Jack's story ended there for some, but it began for many others, because somewhere, someone will dig. And when they find it, they will need the same virtues that brought them here: understanding, courage, perseverance, and the faith that the cycle can, indeed, be broken. And now, tell me, what would you do if you found a time capsule from the future buried in your backyard? Would you ignore it? Would you call someone? Or would you have the courage to open it and face the consequences? Because deep down, this capsule doesn't need to be underground to exist. It can be there inside you. In every decision you postpone, in every feeling you bury, in every dream you put off until later. Are you living in a way that your future self would be proud of? What choices do you need to review today so that you don't receive a letter of regret tomorrow? What legacy are you leaving, even if no one is seeing it? Time is the same for everyone, but what we do with it is what makes us unique. Courage, love, emotional intelligence, generosity. All of this is not from another century. It's in the present. If this story touched you, share it with someone you love. Comment below. What would you put in a time capsule for 2075? And what wouldn't you like to find? Take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because here, with each story, you will discover more about the world, about the future, and most importantly, about yourself. Because at the end of the day, we are all time travelers, trying to understand how to live better in the present.